The silence on a 50-acre rural property on a Sunday morning is a very specific, heavy kind of quiet. It isn't empty, it's deliberate. It's the sound of frost melting off the corrugated steel roof of my 3,000-square-foot workshop. It's the low, rhythmic hum of the industrial climate control system, keeping the bays at a perfect 68 degrees. For a man like me, 58 years old, unmarried by choice, and comfortably retired from the grinding noise of the city, that Sunday morning silence is the ultimate luxury. It is a peace I earned through 3 decades of meticulous, unforgiving blue-collar work. But on this particular Sunday morning, that hard-earned silence was being suffocated by the loud, erratic, and profoundly entitled presence of my older brother, Frank. We were sitting across from each other at the massive, hand-hewn solid oak table in my kitchen. The table was built to last a century. My brother, on the other hand, looked like he was barely surviving the week. Frank has always been a man who lives perpetually on the razor's edge of financial ruin, masked entirely by a thin veneer of upper-middle-class arrogance. He leases luxury cars he can't afford. He holds a mortgage on a subdivision house that eats 60% of his income, and most exhaustingly, he acts as a human shield for his 21-year-old son, Tyler. Tyler is what the psychology books would call a golden child, but what the real world simply calls a parasite. He is a college fraternity senior who has never held a wrench, never paid a utility bill, and lives entirely on maxed-out credit cards and his father's suffocating need to be liked. Frank shifted his weight in the heavy wooden chair, the joints creaking under the sudden movement. He ran a hand over his thinning hair, let out a long, heavy sigh that was designed to make me feel sorry for him, and reached into the breast pocket of his wrinkled golf shirt. He pulled out a flimsy, crumpled personal checkbook. He uncapped a cheap plastic pen, aggressively scribbled a few numbers, ripped the check from the binding, and slid it face up across the polished oak grain. It came to stop an inch from my coffee mug. I didn't pick it up. I didn't even look down at it. I kept my eyes locked directly on Frank's face. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The ceramic mug felt heavy and warm in my calloused hands. "Look, Tom," Frank said, his voice dropping into that familiar, grating tone of faux diplomacy he always used when he wanted me to absorb the cost of his family's mistakes. "He's just a kid. He got himself into a little bit of a bind with some college buddies. He panicked. He needed some quick cash to clear the board, and he made a dumb choice. We've all been young and dumb." Frank tapped the check with his index finger. "I'm writing you a check for $100 right now. Consider it a down payment. I'll throw you $50 a month until we're square. But you need to call the local sheriff's department and tell them it was a misunderstanding. You need to drop this, Tom, for the sake of the family." I let the silence stretch. In negotiations, silence is the heaviest weapon you can wield. People like Frank abhor silence because it forces them to listen to the echo of their own stupidity. "For the sake of the family," I finally repeated, my voice entirely flat, devoid of any anger or immediate emotion. "Exactly," Frank nodded quickly, sensing what he thought was a victory. He leaned back, crossing his arms, suddenly brimming with that unearned confidence. "Besides, let's be entirely honest here, Tom. You're acting like the boy stole the Mona Lisa. It was just taking up space out there in your barn. It was covered in dust. What was it anyway? Just some rusty old Chevy? You got half a dozen junkers out there. You wouldn't have even noticed it was gone if you hadn't gone looking for a spare tire." He actually smiled. He gave me a condescending, older brother smirk, as if I were a foolish, hoarding hermit who was overreacting to a minor inconvenience. To Frank, my life was a mystery he had no interest in solving. He saw my faded flannel shirts, my worn-in Red Wing boots, and my quiet, rural existence, and he immediately equated it to poverty and ignorance. He saw the massive steel barn sitting 200 yards from my back porch, and because he didn't hold the keys, he assumed it was just a graveyard for worthless, rusting scrap metal. He didn't know that behind those heavy steel doors lay a state-of-the-art classic auto restoration facility. He didn't know about the commercial-grade vehicle lifts, the custom fabrication shop, or the heavy-duty climate control. And most critically, he did not know the specific pedigree of the rusty old Chevy his son had just stolen. I set my coffee mug down on the oak table. The solid clink of ceramic against wood sounded like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. It wasn't a rusty old Chevy, Frank, I said quietly. My voice was low, rhythmic, and deadly serious. It was a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. It is a fully documented, numbers-matching, factory four-speed vehicle. It has an original cross-ram intake manifold that I spent 3 years hunting down. Frank's condescending smile began to falter, just slightly at the edges. I left the exterior paint faded. I continued, leaning forward just an inch, locking my eyes onto his. It's called a patina. It's highly sought after in the concourse community, and it acts as perfect camouflage against idiots who don't know what they're looking at. But underneath that faded paint, the chassis, the drivetrain, and the suspension have been meticulously restored to museum-grade perfection over the last 5 years. I reached out with one finger and slowly pushed his pathetic $100 check back across the table until it touched his knuckles. It is currently insured and appraised by Haggerty Classic Auto for exactly $80,000. The blood instantly drained from Frank's face. The ruddy, confident flush of his cheeks vanished, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the $100 check sitting on the table, and for the first time in his life, he mathematically realized the sheer magnitude of the hole his son had dug. 80 grand. Frank finally choked out, his voice a dry whisper. Tom, Tyler said the guy with the tow truck only gave him $5,000 for it. The guy with the tow truck is a chop shop fence. I replied, my tone entirely unsympathetic. Tyler sold a museum-grade piece of automotive history for pennies because he was desperate to pay off a $15,000 illegal sportsbook debt. Tom, please, Frank stammered, his hands suddenly shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. You can't. You have to let me fix this. If I pull from my 401k, maybe I can. You can't fix this, Frank, I interrupted, cutting him off with the precision of a scalpel. Because this isn't just about the physical car anymore. If Tyler had just stolen the keys and taken it for a joyride, maybe we could have handled this at this table. But he didn't. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. Tyler broke into my home office while I was at an auction in Scottsdale. He dug through my locked filing cabinets. He found a blank, duplicate state title. He forged my legal signature on a government document, and he used that forged document to transfer ownership of a high-value asset across state lines to a known felon. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking methodically in the corner of the room. It was exactly 9:15 in the morning. That isn't a family dispute, Frank, I said, my voice dropping into an absolute, freezing calm. That is grand theft auto. That is felony forgery. That is wire fraud. It's a federal crime. Frank stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a sudden, primal panic. I didn't call the local sheriff to report a misunderstanding, I finished, taking one last sip of my coffee. I called the state police auto theft task force. And based on the GPS tracker permanently welded inside the Camaro's frame, the detective informed me that 3 squad cars are pulling up to your son's fraternity house right now. There is a fundamental difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich is loud. Rich is leased luxury SUVs, designer watches bought on credit, and aggressively reminding everyone at the Thanksgiving table about your latest promotion. Wealth, on the other hand, is absolutely silent. Wealth is owning 50 acres of prime, unrestricted rural land free and clear. It's having a zero balance on your credit cards, a deep well of liquid assets, and the absolute freedom to never answer to another man for the rest of your life. My brother Frank spent his entire adult life desperately trying to look rich. I spent mine quietly becoming wealthy. To understand how Tyler, a 21-year-old college senior with the financial literacy of a fruit fly, could look at an $80,000 piece of automotive history and mistake it for scrap metal, you have to understand the profound disconnect between my world and theirs. To the rest of the family, I was simply Uncle Tom. I was the boring, eccentric bachelor who retired early from commercial engineering to go live in the woods. They saw my faded Carhartt jackets, my worn-in Red Wing boots, and the dirt under my fingernails, and they universally mistook my quiet lifestyle for failure. At family gatherings, Frank would clap me on the shoulder, offering unsolicited, condescending advice on how I could leverage my equity to buy a condo in the city and rejoin civilized society. He didn't understand that my 50-acre property was a fortress, and he certainly didn't understand what was sitting inside my barn. From the end of my long, gravel driveway, the building just looked like a standard, heavily weathered agricultural shed. The corrugated steel siding was dull, and the massive sliding doors looked heavy and entirely unremarkable. But that was by design. Camouflage is the best security system a man can buy. If you keyed the security code into the keypad and rolled those heavy doors back, you didn't step into a dusty barn. You stepped into a 3,000-square-foot, state-of-the-art, climate-controlled classic auto restoration facility. The floor was poured concrete, finished with a high-gloss, chemical-resistant epoxy that you could eat off of. The ceiling was lined with daylight-balanced LED arrays. Flanking the center aisle were two commercial-grade, 10,000-pound bin-pack automotive lifts. My tool chests alone, massive, rolling banks of Snap-on and Mac tools, cost more than the down payment on Frank's suburban McMansion. This was my sanctuary. I bought ruined, forgotten pieces of American automotive history, completely disassembled them down to the bare metal frame, and resurrected them to concourse-level perfection. I dealt exclusively with high-net-worth collectors. It was a highly specialized, fiercely lucrative blue-collar niche. But Frank and his wife never bothered to ask what I actually did out here. And they certainly never taught their son to respect the property of others. Tyler was the textbook definition of a generational liability. From the day he was born, Frank shielded him from the natural consequences of his actions. When Tyler was 16, he totaled a brand-new jet ski by ignoring the channel markers and tearing the hull out on a submerged reef. Frank quietly paid the marina to make it go away. When Tyler was 19, he maxed out a high-limit credit card in Frank's name on a spring break trip to Cabo. Frank paid the balance and blamed the credit card company for predatory lending. Tyler learned exactly one lesson from his father. There's always a bailout. There's always a safety net. If you make a mess, you just cry to the family, and the family will sweep it under the rug. By his senior year in his fraternity, Tyler wasn't studying business administration. He was majoring in binge drinking and illegal offshore sports betting. He lived entirely in a state of unearned arrogance, assuming the world would always bend to accommodate his mistakes. Which brings us to the masterpiece sitting in the back corner bay of my shop, the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. I had spent 5 grueling years bringing this specific machine back to life. But I built it using a very specific, highly debated strategy in the restoration community. It's called a survivor patina. To a layman, to a fool like Tyler, the Camaro looked like a piece of absolute junk. I had intentionally left the exterior body exactly as I found it in a barn in Nebraska. The original factory paint was faded to a chalky, dull blue. There was surface rust blooming on the quarter panels. The chrome bumpers were pitted and dull. I threw a heavy, dusty canvas tarp over it to complete the illusion. If you glanced at it, you'd think it was a $2,000 shell waiting to be hauled to the scrap crusher. But underneath that faded, rusty skin, the car was a mechanical holy grail. I had pulled the body off the frame and acid-dipped the chassis. I installed a fully rebuilt, numbers-matching DZ302 cubic inch small block V8. It's an engine specifically designed by Chevrolet in the late 60s to dominate the Trans Am racing circuit. It was bolted to an original Muncie M 24-speed manual transmission and a heavy-duty 12-bolt rear end. I had spent 3 years and $15,000 just tracking down the original factory-correct cross-ram intake manifold and dual Holley carburetors. Every single bushing, every brake line, every wire in the harness was brand new, museum-grade, and meticulously documented in a 3-inch thick binder sitting in my locked office. It was an $80,000 mechanical sleeper. It was designed to look worthless specifically to deter opportunistic thieves. Unfortunately, that exact camouflage is what made it the perfect target for my entitled, desperate nephew. In late October, I locked up the shop, set the perimeter alarms on the main bays, and boarded a flight to Scottsdale, Arizona, for a week-long, high-end classic auto auction. I was hunting for a specific set of cylinder heads for a client's Shelby Mustang. I left my property secured, but I made one critical familial error. A year prior, I had given Frank a spare key to the padlock on the rear utility door of the barn, just in case of a fire or a localized emergency while I was out of town. I assumed my own brother would respect boundaries. I assumed that key would stay on a hook in his kitchen. I severely underestimated the financial desperation of his son. While I was 2,000 miles away, drinking overpriced coffee at an auction block in the desert, Tyler's bookie finally called at his markers. Tyler was in the hole for $15,000 on a string of catastrophic college football bets. He didn't have a dime to his name. His father's credit lines were finally tapped out. The bookie wasn't a bank. He was a guy who broke knees for a living. Tyler panicked. He needed an asset he could liquidate immediately for untraceable cash with zero questions asked. He remembered his crazy, hoarding Uncle Tom out in the woods. He remembered seeing a rusty old Chevy sitting under a tarp in the back of the barn a few Thanksgivings ago. In his arrogant, panicked mind, he genuinely believed I wouldn't even notice it was gone. He thought he was stealing a piece of forgotten trash. He didn't realize he was actively walking into a federal felony trap of his own making. Desperation is a highly predictable emotion. When a man is backed into a financial corner, especially a young man who has never faced a genuine consequence in his entire life, his brain stops processing logic. It only processes survival. While I was 2,000 miles away in the dry heat of the Arizona desert, inspecting the cylinder walls of a rare Shelby block, Tyler's artificial world was violently collapsing. His bookie, a guy running an illegal offshore sports betting ring at a strip mall bar, had finally cut off his credit. The $15,000 Tyler owed wasn't a gentleman's debt. It was the kind of debt that resulted in broken orbital bones and shattered kneecaps. Tyler had exactly 48 hours to clear the board, and his father's credit cards were returning solid declines. He didn't have assets. He didn't have a job, but he remembered the spare emergency key his father kept on the corkboard in their suburban kitchen. And he remembered my barn. According to the timestamps on my security system, Tyler pulled his Jeep Wrangler up to my secondary access gate at exactly 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon. He manually unlocked the heavy chain, drove up the gravel service road, and parked behind the massive steel structure. He used the emergency key to open the reinforced steel utility door. He stepped into the climate-controlled silence of my shop. Now, if Tyler had possessed even an ounce of mechanical literacy, he would have looked around at the commercial-grade lifts, the TIG welders, and the laser alignment racks, and realized he was standing in a high-net-worth commercial facility. But Tyler was functionally blind to blue-collar value. He only saw a quiet place to steal something he assumed I had forgotten about. He walked past a half-finished 1970 Chevelle SS. He walked past a wall of custom-milled aluminum engine blocks. He headed straight to the back bay, where the heavy, dust-covered canvas tarp was draped over a low, wide silhouette. He pulled the heavy canvas back, coughing as the dust swirled in the LED lights. There it sat, the '69 Camaro Z28, the faded, chalky blue paint, the surface rust blooming on the quarter panels, the pitted chrome bumpers. To his untrained, panicked eyes, it was a worthless, abandoned shell, an eyesore. But Tyler wasn't a complete idiot when it came to street hustle. He knew that even a shady scrap metal flipper wouldn't load a car onto a flatbed without a piece of paper proving the kid had the right to sell it. The tow truck drivers who operate in the gray market don't care about the condition of the car, but they care immensely about the paper trail. They need a title to legally crush it or chop it. Tyler left the barn and walked across the gravel driveway to my house. He knew I was out of state. He took a heavy river rock from my landscaping, wrapped it in his frat house sweatshirt, and shattered the back patio door. He stepped over the broken glass and walked directly into my home office. I keep my files meticulously organized in heavy, fireproof locking steel cabinets. Tyler took a flathead screwdriver and a heavy framing hammer from my kitchen drawer and brutally popped the lock on the top drawer. He bypassed the thick, three-ring binder clearly labeled Haggerty Appraisal and Provenance, 69Z28. He didn't read the documents detailing the $80,000 valuation. He was moving too fast, fueled by adrenaline and sheer panic. He just frantically dug through the manila folders until he found what he needed. An old, blank, duplicate state title. In the classic car business, we often hold duplicate titles for older chassis in case the original 50-year-old paper degrades. It was a valid, state-issued document. The owner's signature line was completely blank. Tyler took a blue ballpoint pen from my desk. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the staggering legal threshold he was crossing. He simply pressed the pen to the paper and forged my signature on a government document. With the strike of that pen, Tyler officially escalated his situation from a misdemeanor family dispute to a multi-count federal felony. An hour later, a beat-up diesel flatbed tow truck with no commercial DOT numbers on the doors backed up to my barn. Tyler had found a cache for junk cars, buyer on a sketchy local internet forum. The buyer was a known fence, a guy who runs a chop shop out of a cinderblock warehouse in the next county, stripping stolen cars for untraceable parts. The buyer looked at the faded paint, looked at the forged title, and grinned. He knew he was stealing it. Tyler, desperate and sweating, handed over the keys and the forged state title. The buyer reached into his greasy canvas jacket and handed my nephew a wad of crumpled, dirty $100 bills. $5,000. Exactly enough to pay a third of his bookie debt and keep his kneecaps intact for another month. Tyler watched them winch an $80,000, numbers-matching, museum-grade masterpiece onto a rusty flatbed. He didn't feel guilt. He felt relief. He actually had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to pull out his phone, fan the $5,000 out across his steering wheel, and post a photo to his private social media account with the caption, "Funding secured. Uncle's trash is my treasure." He thought he was a genius. He thought he had outsmarted the system, paid off his violent debts, and pulled one over on his hoarding, clueless uncle. He didn't know about the cameras. The strategic pivot in any confrontation is the moment you absorb the blow, realize the enemy has overextended their supply lines, and consciously decide not to strike back immediately. True justice, the kind that permanently alters the trajectory of a man's life, requires absolute silence. It requires the discipline of the wait. I returned from Scottsdale late Thursday night. The air was cold and crisp as my truck tires crunched up the gravel driveway. The first thing I noticed was the shattered glass on the back patio. I didn't panic. My heart rate didn't elevate. 30 years of working with heavy machinery and volatile chemicals trains the panic out of you. I unholstered my legally concealed sidearm, cleared the house room by room, and confirmed it was empty. I saw the busted lock on the fireproof filing cabinet. I saw the empty space where the duplicate title used to sit. I holstered my weapon, walked out the back door, and headed straight to the barn. The heavy sliding doors were closed, but the side utility door was unlocked. I stepped inside and flipped the master breaker for the overhead LED arrays. The shop flooded with brilliant daylight white light. I looked at the back bay. The heavy canvas tarp was crumpled in a heap on the epoxy floor. The bay was entirely, devastatingly empty. A lesser man would have immediately picked up his phone and started screaming. A lesser man would have called his brother, demanded the money, and threatened violence. But a wealthy man, a man who understands the cold, mechanical leverage of the law, doesn't scream. He gathers data. I walked over to the shop's network rack. Tucked high in the steel rafters, completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, were 4 motion-activated, 4K resolution trail cameras. They were hardwired to a local server with a battery backup. I pulled up the footage on my laptop. I sat in the quiet hum of the barn and watched the entire felony play out in crystal-clear, high-definition video. I watched Tyler break the cabinet. I watched him forge the signature. I watched him hand the document to the tow truck driver. I paused the video, zoomed in on the flatbed, and perfectly captured the deeply faded license plate of the chop shop buyer. I had the means, I had the motive, and I had the undeniable, digitally time-stamped evidence. I didn't call Frank. I didn't call Tyler. I didn't even call the local sheriff's department, Because local deputies have a habit of treating property theft as a low-priority civil matter. Instead, I picked up my cell phone and called a man named Marcus Miller. Detective Miller is the head of the state police auto theft task force. He is a man who hates car thieves with a burning, specialized passion, and he happens to be a man I've played low-stakes poker with on the last Friday of every month for the past 10 years. Tom, Miller's voice crackled over the line. It's late. What do you need? Marcus, I said, staring at the empty bay. Someone just stole the 69 Z28. The line went dead silent for 3 seconds. Miller knew exactly what that car was. He knew the pedigree. He knew the appraisal value. Tell me you have video, he finally said, his voice dropping into his official, strictly business tone. I have 4K video of the break-in, the forgery of a state title, and the handoff, I replied calmly. I also have a license plate of the flatbed. It looks like a gray market fence out of the northern county. Send it all to my encrypted email right now, Miller ordered. Who's the kid in the video, Tom? You recognize him? Yeah, I said, feeling absolutely no remorse for the words I was about to say. It's my nephew, Tyler. Family. Miller sighed heavily. Tom, you know how this works. If I pull the trigger on a task force raid for an $80,000 asset crossing county lines with a forged state title, there is no unringing that bell. I can't write this off as a family misunderstanding tomorrow if you get soft. This is a mandatory minimum sentence for grand theft auto and felony forgery. Are you willing to press full charges on your own blood? He didn't steal a television, Marcus. He stole my legacy to pay a bookie, I said, my voice like crushed ice. Light him up. Give me 48 hours to locate the buyer's warehouse and secure the asset, Miller said. Sit tight. Don't engage the family. And so, I executed the wait. This is the most crucial phase of the trap. You have to let the enemy get comfortable. You have to let them believe they got away with it. I let the 48 hours tick by. I let the chop shop buyer take the Camaro back to his cinderblock warehouse, completely unaware that a GPS tracker was permanently welded deep inside the vehicle's frame. I let him start unbolting the exhaust, which legally upgraded his charges from possession of stolen property to operating an illegal racketeering enterprise. I let Tyler take that $5,000 in cash and hand it over to his violent bookie, instantly evaporating the money and eliminating any possible chance he had of buying his way out of the hole he dug. And, most satisfyingly of all, I let Tyler confidently tell his father that he had cleaned out some worthless junk from my bar to make a few bucks. Which brings us directly back to Sunday morning. To my kitchen. To the heavy oak table. To Frank, sitting across from me, arrogantly sliding a pathetic $100 personal check across the wood, genuinely believing that his bloodline gave him a blank check to steal my life's work. He was about to learn that in my house, the family discount doesn't apply to federal felonies. The silence in my kitchen wasn't just heavy anymore. It was entirely suffocating. I sat completely still, watching the cognitive dissonance violently tear through my brother's mind. Frank was a man who had spent 50 years successfully talking his way out of every minor inconvenience he or his son had ever caused. He was waiting for the punchline. He was waiting for me to crack a smile, to tell him I was exaggerating to teach the boy a lesson, and to accept his pathetic $100 check. But I didn't smile. I just looked at him with the cold, unblinking certainty of a man who holds all the cards and has already locked the doors to the casino. Tom, you're bluffing, Frank finally stammered, his voice cracking. He tried to force a laugh, but it came out as a wet, desperate wheeze. You're trying to scare me. I get it. The kid crossed the line. But $80,000? For a car that looks like it belongs in a scrap crusher? You don't have that kind of money tied up in an old Chevy. And you sure as hell didn't call the state police on your own nephew. He leaned forward, planting his palms flat on the oak table, trying to summon that old, overbearing older brother authority. Now you listen to me, Frank said, his face flushing a dark, angry red. Tyler made a mistake. Boys will be boys. He needed the cash, and he took something he thought you weren't using. It's a civil matter, Tom. It's a family matter. You're going to pick up that phone. You're going to call off whatever bluff you're running with this task force nonsense, and we're going to handle this like men. You owe it to the family name. The family name. I repeated softly, tasting the absolute absurdity of the phrase. I reached down to the empty chair beside me. Sitting on the woven seat cushion was a thick, heavy-stock manila folder. I picked it up, placed it squarely in the center of the table, and flipped it open. "I don't bluff, Frank," I said. "I measure twice, and I cut exactly once." I pulled the first document from the folder and slid it across the polished oak grain until it bumped against his knuckles. It was printed on heavy, watermarked paper. "Read the header," I instructed. Frank looked down. His eyes began to violently dart back and forth across the page. "That is the official, binding insurance policy and concourse-level appraisal from Haggerty Classic Auto," I said, my voice as methodical as a metronome. "It details the exact, verified provenance of the numbers-matching DZ302 engine block, the Muncie M20 transmission, and the factory-correct cross-ram intake manifold. It certifies the survivor patina body. Look at the bottom line, Frank. Read the bold number. $82,500, Frank whispered, the anger draining out of him, replaced instantly by a cold, freezing terror. "Now look at the second page," I said, sliding a glossy, high-resolution 8x10 photograph over the appraisal. It was a still frame from the 4K trail camera hidden in the rafters of my barn. The image was crystal clear, illuminated by the daylight-balanced LED arrays. It perfectly captured Tyler, wearing his Greek-letter fraternity sweatshirt, physically handing a piece of state-issued paper to a heavily tattooed man standing next to a rusty flatbed tow truck. You could see the terrified, desperate sweat on Tyler's forehead. You could read the license plate of the tow truck in the background. "That," I said, pointing a callous finger at the glossy photo, "is a digitally time-stamped image of your son illegally transferring possession of a high-value automotive asset to a known, convicted felon operating in a legal chop shop out of the northern county." Frank's breathing turned shallow and erratic. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a curb and realized a freight train was 6 inches from his face. He reached out with a trembling hand to touch the photograph, but I slapped my palm flat on the table, stopping him. "Don't touch the evidence, Frank," I warned coldly, "because the third document is the one that permanently ends his life as you know it." I slid the final piece of paper across the table. It possessed the heavy, undeniable weight of municipal authority. It was a copy of the sworn police affidavit. When Tyler broke the lock on my fireproof filing cabinet, he didn't just steal the car. I explained, leaning in so close Frank could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. He stole a blank, state-issued duplicate vehicle title. And then he took a blue pen, and he forged my legal signature on the seller's line. Frank audibly gasped. Even he, in all his arrogant ignorance, knew what that meant. Stealing a car is grand theft auto, Frank. It's a heavy charge, but maybe a high-priced lawyer gets it knocked down to joyriding or unauthorized use if the judge is feeling generous, I said, outlining the exact dimensions of the trap. But forging a signature on a government-issued title to facilitate the sale of stolen property across county lines? That elevates it. That is felony forgery. That is wire fraud. That is a mandatory minimum sentence in the state penitentiary. There is no probation for that. There is no high-priced lawyer who can unsign that document. Frank buried his face in his hands. A low, pathetic sob tore out of his throat. The illusion of his wealth, the illusion of his perfect family, and the illusion of his untouchable son had just been vaporized in less than 3 minutes at my kitchen table. "Tom, please," Frank begged, his voice muffled by his hands. "He's your blood. He's 21. You're going to ruin his entire life over a piece of metal." He ruined his own life over a sportsbook debt. "Frank," I corrected him sharply, "I'm simply providing the finalized receipt for his actions." Right at that exact second, as if choreographed by the universe itself, my cell phone vibrated heavily against the oak table. I looked at the caller ID. It was Detective Marcus Miller. I didn't pick up the phone to my ear. I pressed the green button, tapped the speaker icon, and turned the volume all the way up. The audio filled the quiet kitchen. "Miller," I said clearly. "Tom." The detective's voice boomed through the speaker, crisp, and entirely devoid of emotion. In the background of the call, I could hear the chaotic, overlapping sounds of shouting voices, heavy boots stomping on hardwood floors, and the distinct, sharp crackle of police radios. "Give me the status on the asset," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Frank, who was now staring at the phone in sheer, unadulterated horror. "Task Force just raided the Cinderblock warehouse in the northern county," Miller reported. "The buyer is in custody. They had the Camaro up on the lift, but we got there before they could put a cutting torch to the frame. The vehicle is intact. We've secured the asset, and we recovered the forged state title from the buyer's office safe." "Understood," I said. "And the primary suspect?" The background noise on Miller's end shifted. It sounded like he was walking outside. I could hear the wail of a police siren winding down in the distance. "I'm standing on the front lawn of the Delta Kappa house right now," Miller said, his voice laced with the grim satisfaction of a veteran cop closing a tight case. "State troopers just breached the front door. We caught him asleep in his room. Suspect is currently in handcuffs, being escorted out to the cruiser in front of about 50 of his fraternity brothers. We are officially booking him on grand theft auto, felony forgery, and conspiracy to traffic stolen property." Frank let out a sound like a wounded animal. He physically slumped forward, his forehead coming to rest against the cold wood of my kitchen table. "Thanks, Marcus," I said softly. "I'll be down to the precinct in an hour to give my formal statement." I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call. The silence rushed back into the kitchen, but it was no longer my peaceful Sunday morning silence. It was the devastating, permanent silence of a destroyed legacy. I picked up Frank's flimsy $100 personal check from the table. I slowly tore it perfectly in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter down onto the floor like dead leaves. "I believe our business here is concluded, Frank," I said, standing up from the table. "I suggest you leave my property. You have a very expensive bail bondsman to call." There's a very specific kind of walk a man does when his entire worldview has just been surgically dismantled in front of him. It's a hollow, dragging shuffle. I watched Frank perform that walk from my kitchen window. He didn't say another word after I told him to leave. He just pushed himself up from the heavy oak table, his shoulders slumped forward, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked 10 years older than he had when he walked in. He didn't look like the arrogant, suburban patriarch who leased luxury cars to impress his neighbors. He looked like exactly what he was, a deeply indebted man who had just realized his safety net had been completely, permanently cut. He climbed into his pristine, leased SUV. He didn't peel out in anger. He just slowly, numbly reversed down my long, gravel driveway, the tires crunching softly in the quiet Sunday morning air. As his taillights faded past the iron gates, the absolute, unbroken peace of my 50-acre property returned. But for Frank and his son, the noise was just beginning. And the justice system is the loudest, most grinding machine on earth. The fallout over the next 6 months was absolute, comprehensive, and entirely devoid of mercy. When you're 21 years old and your only life experience consists of fraternity parties and daddy's credit card, the reality of the county jail system hits you like a commercial freight train. Tyler was dragged out of his Delta Kappa house in handcuffs, wearing athletic shorts and a t-shirt, while 50 of his supposed brothers stood on the lawn filming him with their phones. By noon that same day, the fraternity's national chapter officially disowned him, terrified of being associated with a federal auto theft and racketeering ring. His university expelled him pending the criminal investigation. He was processed, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell with hardened, violent men who didn't care about his zip code or his golf handicap. Frank, operating on pure, frantic denial, immediately tried to throw money at the problem. He hired a high-profile, aggressively expensive criminal defense attorney from the city. The lawyer demanded a $50,000 retainer up front just to look at the file. To fund this, Frank had to do the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. He had to publicly admit he was broke. He liquidated his pathetic 401k, taking a massive early withdrawal penalty. He took out a predatory second mortgage on his subdivision McMansion. He drained his wife's savings. He burned his entire financial facade to the ground just to secure legal representation for his golden child. 2 weeks later, that $50,000 lawyer sat Frank and Tyler down in a sterile conference room and delivered the brutal, unvarnished truth. There was no defense. There was no loophole. There was no good old boy judge who was going to wave a magic wand and make this disappear. The state prosecutor had the 4K daylight-balanced, digitally time-stamped video of the break-in. They had the forged, state-issued duplicate title with Tyler's fingerprints embedded in the paper fibers. They had the sworn testimony of the chop shop owner, who immediately flipped on Tyler to secure a lighter sentence for his own racketeering charges. And they had the undeniable $80,000 Haggerty appraisal proving the staggering severity of the theft. The lawyer told Frank that if they took this to a jury trial, Tyler would be facing a maximum of 15 years in the state penitentiary for grand theft auto, felony forgery, and wire fraud. The only option was to beg for a plea deal. Tyler didn't get a slap on the wrist. He didn't get probation and community service. The judge, disgusted by the sheer arrogance and the predatory nature of forging a family member's signature to pay off an illegal sports betting debt, handed down a hard sentence. Tyler was sentenced to 36 months in the state penitentiary. 3 full years of his youth, locked in a concrete box, stripped of his name, his entitlement, and his freedom. All for $5,000 in crumpled bills that he didn't even get to keep. As for the buyer, Detective Miller's task force absolutely dismantled his operation. The cinderblock warehouse in the northern county was raided by SWAT. They recovered my Camaro, along with 6 other stolen vehicles, hundreds of thousands of dollars in strip parts, and a ledger detailing a massive interstate trafficking ring. The fence went away for a decade. The day after the raid, I drove my heavy-duty diesel truck down to the police impound lot. Detective Miller met me at the gate. He handed me the keys and the forged title, stamped heavily with the word void in red ink. We walked back to the secure bay, and there she sat, the 69 Z28, the faded, chalky blue paint, the pitted chrome, the survivor patina that had completely fooled my arrogant nephew. She was completely untouched. The task force had breached the chop shop before the thieves could even put a wrench to the DZ302 engine block. I slid behind the wheel, pumped the gas pedal twice to prime the dual Holley carburetors, and turned the key. The massive, high-compression V8 roared to life, the heavy cam shaking the entire chassis with a deep, rhythmic, terrifying mechanical heartbeat. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated victory. I drove her back to my 50 acres. I pulled her into the climate-controlled bay, lowered the heavy steel doors, and locked the hardened steel padlock. This brings us to the core truth of the matter. The harsh, unforgiving reality that people like Frank and Tyler spend their entire lives trying to outrun. There's a pervasive, dangerous myth in our society called the family discount. It's the poisonous idea that sharing a bloodline automatically grants you a blank check to disrespect a man's boundaries, steal his labor, and pillage his life's work. Entitled people genuinely believe that the word family is a magical shield that protects them from the cold, mechanical consequences of the real world. They look at a quiet man who minds his own business, a man who doesn't flaunt his wealth or scream for attention, and they mistake that profound silence for weakness. They see a dusty tarp, and they assume the man underneath it is a fool. But what they fail to understand is that the quietest men are almost always the most dangerous. A man who built his empire with his own 2 hands, a man who knows the exact value of a dollar and the precise weight of the law, does not need to raise his voice to destroy you. He doesn't need to throw a punch. He just needs to step back, secure his assets, and let your own staggering arrogance lead you directly into the trap. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but must be earned. Justice, however, is mandatory. Blood does not give you the right to steal a man's legacy. And if you force a wealthy, disciplined man to choose between protecting his peace and protecting your feelings, you are going to lose everything you have. This has been Dante's Stories. Stay sharp, guard your assets, and I'll see you in the next one.